April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above Conques, France. Ice crystals formed geometric patterns across the plexiglass canopy as Second Lieutenant Robert Buzz Miller scanned the sky through frozen breath CL. Odds, his gloved hand resting on the throttle of his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The oxygen mask hissed with each breath, a rhythmic reminder that he was 5 miles above the Earth in a machine he'd flown for exactly 47 hours, below his formation. The French countryside spread like a patchwork quilt stitched with roads and rivers. Beautiful and indifferent to the violence about to unfold. Miller's radio crackled with the calm voice of Major Donald Blakesley, former Eagle Squadron veteran now commanding the 335th Fighter Squadron, calling out the bandits at 2 o'clock high. Miller rolled his head right and felt his stomach drop as he counted the enemy fighters 16 Focke-Wulf 190s in perfect swarm formation. Their camouflaged fuselages catching the morning sun as they positioned for attack. From his cockpit above, Oberleutnant Ralph Hemsworth of Jagdgeschwader 26 studied the American fighters climbing laboriously toward his formation. Their ungainly silhouettes struggling against gravity and thin air. Hemsworth was a 20-mission veteran, a survivor of the Russian front and the Channel battles, and he'd never seen fighters so grotesquely proportioned barrel-shaped fuselages. Topped with greenhouse canopies, wings that seemed too small for bodies to large propellers that dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. He keyed his radio transmitter and his voice carried the casual confidence of a predator spotting wounded prey. "The Americans have sent us flying milk bottles," he transmitted to his wingman. Unable to suppress the laughter that came naturally when viewing these corpulent machines, his wingman responded with his own observation about pregnant cows pretending to be fighters, and several other pilots chimed in with jokes about American bombers that forgot their bomber crews. The German formation began their bounce, rolling inverted and diving with practiced precision. Their BMW 801 radial engines howling as airspeed built past 400 miles per hour. Hemsworth selected his target, a P-47 flying tail-end Charlie in the American formation, the position every fighter pilot knew was the most vulnerable. His gunsight pipper settled on the Thunderbolt's massive engine cowling, and his finger moved to the trigger, already anticipating the satisfying sight of the American fighter coming apart under his 20mm cannon fire. What Hemsworth couldn't know, what none of the German pilots circling like wolves could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would systematically destroy the Luftwaffe. Fierce fighter on. Within 18 months, these flying milk bottles would transform from objects of derision into instruments of terror, their 8 Browning machine guns becoming the most feared sound in German skies. The mathematics of destruction were already loaded in those broad wings, 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, a combined rate of fire approaching 6,000 rounds per minute. Enough concentrated firepower to saw a Messerschmitt in half in less than 2 seconds of sustained fire. Miller saw the Germans coming and his training took over, pushing the throttle forward past the war emergency power tent. Feeling the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine respond with a surge of power that pressed him back into his armored seat. The turbocharger spooled up with a rising whine, forcing compressed air into the engine's 18 cylinders. Maintaining sea-level performance in air so thin a man couldn't survive without supplemental oxygen. His Thunderbolt accelerated with surprising authority for its 7-ton mass. But acceleration wasn't the same as maneuverability, and the Focke-Wulfs were already inside firing range. The sky erupted with traces orange streams that appeared deceptively slow until they flashed past at 2,800 feet per second, some missing by inches, others striking with sounds like hammers on sheet metal. Miller broke hard right, pulling the stick into his lap, feeling the G-forces crush him down into his seat as his vision tunneled and grayed at the edges. The P-47 responded sluggishly compared to the fighters he'd trained on. its wings protesting the tight turn. But it responded, and that was enough. A Focke-Wulf flashed through his field of view to fast for a shot, and then the sky was empty of immediate threats, filled instead with the chaotic swirl of 16 American fighters and 16 German fighters all trying to kill each other in a cubic mile of frozen sky above occupied France. This was the baptism, the moment when theory met reality, when training met combat. When American pilots learned whether their massive fighters could survive against the most experienced fighter force in the world. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt began not in combat but in panic. In June 1940, when German fighters swept across France with a speed and efficiency that shattered every assumption about modern warfare, Ian Alexander Cardvalley, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, received urgent specifications from the United States Army Air Corps that read more like a wish list than engineering requirements. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching a Luftwaffe's best, with performance that exceeded anything currently flying, and they wanted it fast because the world was burning and America might be next. Cardvalley stood before his design team in Republic's Farmingdale facility on Long Island and delivered a statement that would have ended most engineering careers. It will be a dinosaur. He admitted studying the faces of the men who would transform his vision into metal and rivets, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions. What emerged from his drafting tables was a machine that violated every principle of contemporary fighter design, built round the most powerful engine available and wrapped in enough airframe to harness that power at altitudes where conventional fighters gasped for oxygen. The heart of Cardvalley's monster was the Pratt & Whitney R280 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower and weighed 2,360 pounds by itself, more than some entire fighters from the previous war. But raw power meant nothing without altitude performance, and that is where Cardvalley's design became revolutionary. He wrapped the engine in a turbo-supercharger system that used exhaust gases to spin a turbine at 22,000 revolutions per minute, compressing incoming air and forcing it into the engine's intake manifolds. This system required complex ducting that ran through the rear fuselage, giving the aircraft its distinctive pregnant appearance, with the turbine buried deep in the tail where a direct flak hit could explode the entire assembly. Like a bomb, the P-47B prototype that first flew on May 6, 1941 shocked everyone who approached it on the Farmingdale flight line at 900 pounds empty. It weighed 65% more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer, and loaded with fuel and ammunition tipped the scales at nearly 13,000 pounds. As heavy as some twin-engine aircraft, test pilot Lowry Brabham walked round the machine 3 times before climbing into the cockpit, studying the massive 13-foot propeller, the wide-track landing gear that gave it a bulldog stance, the armored cowling that protected the engine like medieval plate armor. Republic's engineers had briefed him on the specifications, but seeing the aircraft in 3 dimensions was different from reading numbers on paper. This thing actually flies, he asked the ground crew chief, who responded with a shrug that conveyed both confidence and uncertainty. Brabham fired up the Double Wasp and the entire airframe shook as 18 cylinders came to life, the propeller blast strong enough to push maintenance carts across the tarmac. He advanced the throttle and felt the Thunderbolt surge forward with authority that belied its mass, accelerating down the runway with a rumbling thunder that would give the aircraft its name. At 80 miles per hour the tail came up and suddenly the forward visibility improved dramatically. Brabham could see the runway stretching ahead, the trees beyond, the Long Island Sound in the distance. At 100 miles per hour he pulled back on the stick and the P-47 leaped into the air with an eagerness that surprised him. Climbing away from Farmingdale at 2,500 feet per minute, eating altitude like a homesick angel despite carrying more weight than bombers from the previous decade. At 15,000 feet, Brabham engaged the turbo-supercharger and felt the engine respond with a surge of power that shouldn't have been possible in air less than the manifold pressure gauge held steady. At 42 inches, sea level performance at 3 miles altitude and the climb rate barely diminished. He pushed the Thunderbolt higher, watching the altimeter unwind through 20,000 feet, then 25,000, then 30,000. Levels where earlier fighters struggled to maintain formation. And still the double Wasp pulled strongly, still the controls responded crisply. Still the aircraft climbed as if altitude meant nothing. At 35,000 feet, nearly 7 miles above the Earth, Brabham leveled off and looked round at a world few pilots had ever seen. The sky above was nearly black. The curvature of the Earth visible at the horizon. The air so thin that his indicated airspeed read 60 miles per hour slower than his true speed. Through the atmosphere, he rolled the P-47 into a dive and watched the airspeed build 300 miles per hour, 400, 450. The aircraft solid and stable as a locomotive, no buffeting or flutter. Just smooth acceleration that seemed unlimited. At 500 miles per hour the controls stiffened as shock waves formed on the wings, a phenomenon called compressibility that wouldn't be fully understood for years. But Brabham pulled out smoothly at 20 feet and climbed back to altitude, his report to Cartwright, containing one sentence that would define the Thunderbolt as future: this airplane owns the sky. Above 25,000 feet, the transition from test flights to combat operations revealed truths that no amount of stateside training could predict. And for the American pilots arriving in England throughout late 1942 and early 1943, those truths came wrapped in aluminum coffins. Major Hubert Zemp, commanding the 56th Fighter Group training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, watched his unit lose 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents between September 1942 and January 1943, deaths that occurred not from enemy action but from the P-47's unforgiving characteristics when handled incorrectly. The Thunderbolt ground looped on landing when pilots failed to respect its massive torque, swinging violently off the runway and collapsing landing gear with sounds like artillery strikes. It torque rolled on takeoff when inexperienced pilots added full power too quickly. The enormous propeller creating rotational forces that flipped aircraft inverted before pilots could react. It dove with such enthusiasm that pilots discovered compressibility firsthand, their controls freezing solid as shock waves formed on the wings. The aircraft plummeting toward Earth in dives that ended in smoking craters scattered across Connecticut farmland. Zemk stood beside these craters and studied the wreckage, trying to understand how an aircraft could be simultaneously the best high-altitude fighter in the world and a widowmaker that killed more Americans in training than Germans would in the first months of combat. The British Royal Air Force, observing American training operations with polite skepticism, quietly suggested that perhaps the P-47 was not suited for combat operations in the European theater. That perhaps the Americans might consider adopting Spitfires or requesting Hurricanes aircraft with proven combat records and forgiving handling characteristics. But the United States Army Air Forces had committed to the Thunderbolt, and commitment meant learning to master the beast or dying in the attempt. By April 1943, surviving pilots had developed hard-won understanding of their Montez characteristics. You didn't horse the P-47 around the sky like a lightweight fighter. You flew it with smooth inputs and respected its mass. You used power instead of maneuverability. You thought 3 moves ahead because the Thunderbolt's momentum meant corrections took time and distance. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would become one of America's top aces, described his first combat-ready flight in terms that mixed terror and exhilaration. It was like strapping "Yourself to a locomotive," he told his squadron mates over warm beer in the officers' club. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it so much as aim it at the sky and hold on while physics did the work. The first combat encounters in April and May 1943 confirmed every German prejudice about American fighters and revealed the vast gap between training and survival. The P-47s couldn't turn with Focke-Wulf 190s in horizontal maneuvers, watching the German fighters complete to full circles while the Thunderbolts struggled through one wide arc. They couldn't climb with Messerschmitt 109s at medium altitudes. The German fighters ascending at angles that seemed impossible, while American pilots pushed their throttles forward and watched the enemy disappear upward. They couldn't match the nimble handling that came from lightweight construction and decades of fighter design evolution. Every engagement becoming a struggle to translate theoretical advantages into practical survival. Luftwaffe pilots quickly developed tactics to exploit these weaknesses, attacking from below air. The heavy Thunderbolts struggled to dive without building excessive speed, forcing turning fights where agility mattered more than firepower, using their superior climb rate to disengage at will. Hauptmann Joseph Priller, commanding WW2 26, transmitted a report to Luftwaffe headquarters after his first encounter with P-47s that dripped with contempt. "The new American fighter is meat for our slaughter," he wrote in precise German that translated badly into English. "It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys are calling them Indiana, fat targets, pretending to be warriors." The statistics from those early missions seemed to confirm German confidence in their tactical superiority. In their first month of operations, American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts in combat for only 3 confirmed German kills, a ratio that would be unsustainable in any extended campaign. Royal Air Force liaison officers observing from their Spitfire squadrons quietly suggested the Americans might reconsider their choice of Mount British pilots, joking that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap from your seat and run round the roomy cockpit while the enemy tried to figure out what you were doing. But something strange was happening in those early encounters that German intelligence officers failed to notice because they were counting kills instead of analyzing damage, measuring success by aircraft destroyed rather than understanding the implications of aircraft that survived. The P-47s that were shot down had absorbed incredible punishment before falling, damage levels that would have disintegrated Messerschmitts or Spitfires in seconds of sustained fire. One aircraft from the 78th Fighter Group returned from a May 4th mission over St. Omer with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes. Damage that included a shattered canopy, severed control cables, punctured fuel tanks, and an engine with 2 cylinders completely destroyed. The pilot, Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, landed successfully at his home field and walked away from an aircraft that mechanics initially declared a total write-off. Though Republic engineers later determined that 70% of the structure was salvageable. More significantly, when P-47s did get their guns on target, the results were catastrophic in ways that German pilots had never experienced from rifle-caliber weapons. June 26, 1943 began as routine escort duty over northern France, but it would end with an encounter that defied every assumption about combat damage and demonstrated the Thunderbolt's survivability in terms that shocked both sides of the conflict. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron flew tail-end Charlie position in a formation of 40 P-47s returning from bomber escort, his eyes scanning the sky with the practiced rhythm of a pilot who understood that relaxation meant death. The German attack came from the Sun 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from WW2 26 led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand. Galland, younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland, diving with textbook precision and overwhelming speed advantage that turned theoretical tactics into brutal reality. Johnson's Thunderbolt. Flying at the rear of the formation where visibility was worse and protection was minimal. Caught the concentrated fire of multiple attackers in the first 3 seconds of combat. To 20mm cannon shells exploded across his aircraft with sounds like sledgehammers striking sheet metal, one detonating against the engine cowling and blowing away to cylinders. In a spray of aluminum fragments and engine oil, another striking the canopy track and welding a plexiglass dome shot in a shower of sparks. Machine gun rounds stitched across the fuselage, puncturing hydraulic lines and filling the cockpit with red fluid that looked disturbingly like blood, severing control cables that left the elevator. Controls mushy and unresponsive, shattering instruments across the panel in cascades of broken glass. Johnson felt impacts strike his aircraft like a giant fist, punching the airframe. Felt shrapnel slice through his leather jacket and cut his nose and left leg. Felt the Thunderbolt shudder and yaw as systems failed and structure bent under stress never anticipated by Republic-S engineers. Fire erupted behind the instrument panel, small flames that licked at wiring and threatened to engulf the cockpit, and Johnson's training took over as he reached for the canopy jettison handle and pulled hard, expecting the greenhouse canopy to blast away in the slipstream. The handle moved, but nothing happened. The 20mm shell that had struck the canopy track had fused metal to metal, trapping Johnson inside a burning aircraft at 27,000 feet, with no way out and no parachute escape possible. He tried again, pulling with both hands, feeling tendons strain in his arms. And still the canopy remained locked in place, as if welded by some malicious god who wanted him to burn alive in the frozen sky above France. The engine was dying, its 18 cylinders reduced to 16 functional ones. Oil pressure dropping, cylinder head temperature climbing into the red zone. But somehow it continued running with the stubborn persistence of American engineering that refused to quit even when physics said it should. Johnson leveled the wings using what little control authority remained, pointed the nose toward England, and began the longest flight of his life, with oil covering the windscreen so completely that forward visibility was zero. Navigation reduced to guessing direction by the sun's position and praying that his heading was close enough to reach friendly territory. Then the situation got worse in ways that transformed a survival story into legend. Alone, Focke-Wulf 190 from the 2nd Staffel of Jagdgeschwader 26 discovered the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the channel at less than 170 miles per hour, trailing smoke and flying so slowly that staying behind it required the German pilot to reduce power and extend flaps to avoid overshooting. Historical research has never definitively identified this pilot, though all names have been proposed based on German combat reports from that day. But his actions over the next 5 minutes would become one of the most extraordinary encounters in aerial warfare history. The German pilot positioned himself 200 yards behind Johnson's P-47 and opened fire with his 20mm cannon and 13mm machine guns, a weapons package that delivered more destructive power in a single burst than entire fighter formations from the previous war. Johnson, unable to evade or defend, could only huddle behind his armor plate and feel his aircraft shudder as cannon shells exploded against structure, blowing away pieces of tail, puncturing wings, severing more control cables. The German expended his entire cannon ammunition load in 3 sustained bursts, perhaps 60 shells total, each one capable of destroying an aircraft with a direct hit. And still the Thunderbolt flew with mechanical stubbornness that bordered on supernatural. The Focke-Wulf pulled alongside, and Johnson could see the German pilot's face clearly through his oil-streak side window. Could see his expression shift from confidence to confusion as he studied the flying wreck that refused to fall. The pilot was young, perhaps 25, with blonde hair visible beneath his leather-flying helmet. His face showing emotions that cycled from professional satisfaction to genuine bewilderment as he tried to understand what kept this aircraft in the sky. He repositioned behind Johnson and opened fire again, this time with only his machine gun since his cannon ammunition was exhausted, and Johnson felt hundreds of 13mm rounds strike his aircraft. Felt pieces of structure separate and tumble away. Felt control surfaces shred under the hammering impacts. Still the P-47 flew, its massive radial engine coughing and missing but producing enough power to maintain altitude. Its control cable severed but with enough redundancy that Johnson could still influence direction. Through sheer physical force on the stick, the German pulled alongside a second time close enough that Johnson could have reached out and touched his wing if the canopy hadn't been sealed shut and the enemy pilot shook his head. In apparent amazement, his expression now showing something that looked like fear or respect or perhaps both mixed together. He gave what appeared to be an informal salute, a gesture captured in Johnson's memory with perfect clarity, then peeled away and disappeared toward France, either out of ammunition or unwilling to waste more time on an aircraft that refused to die according to any rational rules of aerial combat. Johnson's P-47 continued flying for another 40 minutes, crossing the English Channel at 500 feet altitude with the engine threatening to seize at any moment. Finally reaching the RAF emergency field at Manston, where Johnson dropped the landing gear using the manual backup system and brought the Thunderbolt down in a landing that bent the airframe and collapsed one main gear but left the pilot alive. The ground crew chief approached the aircraft and stopped counting bullet holes after reaching 200. His inspection revealing damage that should have resulted in immediate structural failure. One cannon shell had exploded inches from Johnson's head, stopped only by the armored glass windscreen that now looked like frosted ice. Another had detonated against the armor plate behind his seat, denting it inward but not penetrating, leaving an impact crater you could fit your fist into. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone running the length of the fuselage, were shot through with holes large enough to pass a broom handle. Yet the airframe had maintained enough integrity to fly and land. The survival of Johnson's aircraft sent tremors through both air forces and fundamentally altered the tactical calculus of fighter combat over Europe, forcing American pilots to reassess their mount's capabilities and German pilots to confront an uncomfortable reality about American engineering philosophy. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, had been flying P-47 since the beginning and losing pilots with depressing regularity. But Johnson's return from what should have been certain death provided the key insight that would transform American tactics from defensive survival to offensive dominance. Zemke called his squadron commanders together in the operations shack at Halesworth Airfield and drew diagrams on a chalkboard that explained the new tactical doctrine. With brutal simplicity: don't turn with them, don't climb with them at low altitude, use your weight. Use your power, use your guns, fight the Thunderbolts, fight instead of the enemy, fight. The massive weight that initially seemed like a disadvantage became a weapon when properly employed. Because physics didn't care about pilot skill or tactical brilliance, physics simply converted potential energy into kinetic energy with mathematical certainty. A P-47 at 30,000 feet possessed enormous potential energy stored in its altitude. And when that altitude was traded for speed in a dive, the resulting velocity exceeded anything German fighters could achieve even in vertical descents. From high altitude, a Thunderbolt could reach 550 miles per hour in a dive, faster than terminal velocity for lighter aircraft. Fast enough that pursuing fighters fell behind as if anchored to the sky. This speed could be converted back to altitude in a zoom climb that left enemy fighters helplessly below, unable to follow, unable to engage. reduced to watching as American fighters climbed back to their high perches and prepared for another attack. Captain Walker Mahurin, who had become the first American ace in Europe with victories that eventually totaled 21 confirmed kills, developed what became known as the boom and zoom tactic. Though pilots simply called it the Thunderbolt turkey shoot because executed properly it was less a fair fight than organized slaughter. The doctrine was simple but required discipline that went against every fighter pilot's instinct to engage, and dogfight P-47 formations would climb to 30,000 feet or higher positions, where the turbo-supercharged engines maintained full power, while German fighters gasped for oxygen, in air so thin that conventional superchargers struggled to compress enough to sustain combustion. When Luftwaffe fighters appeared below, inevitably at lower altitudes where their performance was better, the Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive with the patience of hawks spotting field mice, build in speed until the airframe shook and controls stiffened, reaching velocities that made deflection shooting nearly impossible for defending Germans because the closure rate exceeded human reaction time. At the bottom of these dives, traveling at speeds that blurred the landscape below, American pilots would line up their targets and press the trigger. And neat Browning machine guns would speak with a voice that German pilots learned to fear more than flak or engine failure. The gun camera footage from these attacks, analyzed frame by frame at Fighter Command Headquarters, revealed destruction on scales that seemed impossible from rifle-caliber weapons aircraft didn't just fall damaged, they disintegrated under the concentrated fire wing separating from fuselage's tail sections tumbling away independently, cockpits exploding in showers of aluminum and fabric. A 2-second burst put approximately 160 half-inch projectiles into a cone of fire that converged at 300 yards, creating a probability cloud of destruction where survival was mathematical impossibility rather than tactical challenge. German pilots who survived these encounters described it as facing a wall of lead, a barrier of bullets so dense that evasion was meaningless. Aircraft simply flew into the stream and ceased to exist as functional machines. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful aces with 206 victories accumulated on both Eastern and Western fronts, encountered the new American tactics on October 8, 1943. During a bomber interception mission over Bremen, and his experience illustrated how completely the balance had shifted. Philipp was leading Jag Jeshwater 1 against AB-17 formation at 28,000 feet, when P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group appeared above at 32,000 feet, positioned perfectly for bounce attacks that would exploit every Thunderbolt advantage. At this altitude, Philipp's Focke-Wulf 190A6 was already struggling, its BMW 801 radial engine producing perhaps 70% of its rated power in air too thin for efficient combustion. The aircraft mushy and unresponsive in a way that made combat maneuvering feel like swimming through mud. When the Thunderbolts rolled into their attack dives, Philipp recognized the danger immediately and called for his formation to break and dive away. The standard Luftwaffe defensive tactic that used superior maneuverability at lower altitudes to escape and regroup. But the P-47s followed them down, and instead of losing speed in the dive as Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs did, the American fighters accelerated past them, their massive weight and streamlined design allowing them to catch German fighters that were already at full throttle in descending flight. Robert Johnson, now an experienced combat pilot with multiple victories, was flying at 31,000 feet when he spotted Philipp's distinctive Focke-Wulf with its elaborate nose hut. And he rolled into his attack dive with the calm precision of a marksman at a shooting range. The P-47 accelerated past 500 miles per hour, faster than Johnson had ever flown before, the airframe groaning and shaking as shock waves formed on the wings. but the controls remained responsive enough for minor corrections. At 28,000 feet, he was behind Phillips' aircraft and still accelerating, the range decreasing with geometric rapidity. The gunsight pipper settling on the German fighter's fuselage with mechanical certainty. Johnson opened fire at 300 yards with 30-degree deflection, allowing for the target's movement and his own excessive speed, and watched his tracers walk across the Focke-Wulf from tail to nose in a line of orange fire that sparkled with impacts. The German aircraft exploded not gradually, but instantaneously, transforming from functional fighter into expanding cloud of burning debris in less time than it took to describe the event. And Johnson pulled out of his dive at 15,000 feet, climbed back to altitude and prepared for another attack as if he'd just completed a training exercise, rather than killed one of Germany's most experienced pilots. The Thunderbolt S-weapon system represented a quantum leap in fighter armament that German pilots struggled to comprehend until they experienced it firsthand. And by then, comprehension usually came too late to matter. Each P-47 carried 8 Browning M2 machine guns mounted in each wing outboard of the propeller arc. Each weapon fed by a 425-round ammunition box positioned behind the gun bay and connected through electric boost motors that prevented jamming during high-G maneuvers. The combined ammunition load of 3,400 rounds weighed nearly 900 pounds by itself, more than the entire empty weight of some early war fighters. And this weight was carried in addition to fuel, pilot, armor, and structure. The guns themselves were marvels of American mass production, each one machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch despite being manufactured by the tens of thousands in factories staffed by workers who had never seen a machine gun before Pearl Harbor. The standard M2 Browning fired 50 caliber ammunition at 800 rounds per minute per gun, which translated to a combined rate of fire approaching 400 rounds per minute when all 8 weapons fired simultaneously, though actual rate of fire varied slightly due to synchronization delays and barrel heating, the convergence pattern. The point where all 8 guns' ballistic trajectories intersected was typically set at 300 yards, creating a cone of fire that measured approximately 6 feet in diameter at optimal range. Anything that entered this convergence zone faced mathematical certainty rather than probability, with 8 guns firing the target area received approximately 107 half-inch projectiles per second, each one traveling to 900 feet per second and carrying kinetic energy sufficient to penetrate armor plates, sever structural members, or ignite fuel systems. The ammunition itself demonstrated American industrial capacity at scales that German logistics officers found incomprehensible when captured documents revealed the numbers. The standard combat load mixed armor-piercing incendiary, tracer, and ball ammunition in patterns designed to both destroy structure and ignite anything flammable, with typical loadouts running for API. 1 APIT, and 1 ball round in repeating sequence. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds used a delayed action fuse that ensured penetration before detonation, the hardened steel penetrator punching through aluminum skin and then igniting an incendiary compound that burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to melt aluminum structure and ignite fuel vapors, the tracer rounds contained phosphorus compounds that burned brilliantly in flight, allowing pilots to observe their fire and make corrections. Though experienced pilots learned to watch for strikes rather than tracers, because the 1 in 6 tracer ratio meant that for every glowing round they saw 5 invisible ones were already hitting the target. Major David Schilling leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron during the August 17, 1943 dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg encountered a formation of Messerschmitt 110 destroyer aircraft positioning to attack B-17s with their heavy cannon and rocket armament, and his subsequent engagement demonstrated The Thunderbolts' firepower with clinical precision, the twin-engine German fighters. Heavily armed but less maneuverable than single-engine types, were the Luftwaffe specialized bomber killers, carrying 30mm cannon and 21cm rockets that could destroy AB-17 from beyond defensive gun range. They were also vulnerable when caught by fighters, their size and weight making evasion difficult, their crews consisting of pilot, radio operator, and rear gunner, all of whom would die if the aircraft was destroyed. Schilling's flight of Thunderbolts rolled into attack dives from 28,000 feet, building speed until their airframe shook. And the German formation below never had a chance to react before American guns spoke. Unteroffizier Henrik Roth, a gunner in one of the Mi-110s who survived by bailing out before his aircraft exploded, later recounted the attack in a POW interrogation that was recorded and filed in American intelligence archives. The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven, Roth said through a translator, his hands shaking as he described what he'd witnessed. I opened fire at 800 meters with my MG-81 machine gun. Good hits. I saw them strike the lead fighter's wing. The P-47 didn't even wobble. Didn't slow down. Just kept coming like my bullets were raindrops against a locomotive. Then he fired and the aircraft ahead of us simply came apart. Not shot down, but destroyed. Wings separated from fuselage, tail severed, the crew compartment shredded into metal confetti. Into seconds, Mi-110 became nothing but falling debris. 8 Messerschmitt 110s were destroyed in less than 1 minute of combat, their crews having no time to bail out, no time to transmit warnings. No time to do anything except die as concentrated machine gun fire tore through structure designed to withstand rifle-caliber defensive fire from bombers, but utterly inadequate against the massed firepower of Thunderbolt attacks. The gun camera footage from Schilling's aircraft later used in training films showed the destruction in clinical detail. The first Mi-110 simply disintegrated as tracer streams converged on its center fuselage, the wings folding upward and separating the cockpit, exploding in a shower of plexiglass fragments, the entire aircraft transforming from functional machine to scattered wreckage in 1.7 seconds of sustained fire. The second aircraft tried to evade, banking hard right, but the Thunderbolt-S guns tracked through the turn and the convergence pattern caught the Mi-110's left engine, which exploded with enough force to tear the wing off, sending the aircraft into an inverted spin from which no recovery was possible. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Skobreski, who would become the top American ace in Europe with 28 victories, described the effect of concentrated .50 caliber fire in terms that mixed technical observation with visceral horror. When you hit them with all 8 guns at convergence range, they don't just go down damaged. They explode like they're made of tissue paper. I saw a 109 literally cut in half at the cockpit, the tail section falling one way while the nose and engine fell another. The pilot never knew what hit him because the rounds were hitting faster than nerve impulses could transmit pain signals. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound and cumulative, building from initial respect to growing fear to something approaching terror as more pilots experienced the Thunderbolt-S for airpo war and fewer pilots survived to describe it. Luftwaffe intelligence officers interviewing pilots who had faced P-47s noted recurring themes in their reports. The Americans didn't fire in short bursts like German pilots, conserving limited cannon ammunition. They fired in sustained streams that seemed to last forever, pouring bullets into target areas until nothing remained but smoke and falling debris. By January 1944, a new variant of the P-47 began arriving in England that would complete the transformation from defensive escort fighter to offensive multi-role destroyer, and German troops, who had learned to fear the Thunderbolt in air combat, were about to discover that the same Aircraft could devastate ground targets with equal efficiency. The P-47 featured a Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller with paddle blades, broad-chord wooden blades 13 feet in diameter that bit into the air like massivores. And the improvement in climb rate was immediate and dramatic. Where earlier Thunderbolts had climbed at an anemic 200 feet per minute at sea level, struggling to gain altitude against nimble German fighters, the paddle blade variants could achieve 3.0 feet per minute, matching or exceeding Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s at most altitudes, and completely dominating them above 25,000 feet. Where turbo-supercharged advantage became overwhelming, the massive propeller also improved acceleration in level flight, allowing P-47s to build energy faster when maneuvering, closing the performance gap that had made early models vulnerable in turning engagements. Hauptmann Heinz Nock of Jagdgeschwader 11, a veteran with over 200 combat missions who had survived the Russian front and years of Western Front combat, encountered the new variants in February 1944 during a bomber interception near Hanover, and his combat diary entry revealed how completely German tactical assumptions had been invalidated. The fat American fighters have learned to climb, Nock wrote in precise handwriting that contrasted with the urgency of his words. We bounced a formation near Hanover expecting our usual altitude advantage. They turned into us and climbed with us, matching our rate and then exceeding it when we tried to disengage and climb away. They followed us up to 30,000 feet where their engines still pulled strongly while ours gasped and faltered. Schmidt was caught in this climb and blown apart by concentrated fire, nothing left but smoke and fragments tumbling through the sky. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year. The paddle blade propeller did more than improve performance. It changed the sound of the Thunderbolt in ways that had psychological impact beyond its tactical significance. The distinctive thundering roar created by blade tips reaching supersonic speeds could be heard from miles away, a deep, threatening rumble that announced American presence long before visual contact. And German ground troops reported being able to identify approaching P-47s by sound alone, even when multiple aircraft types were operating in the same area. They began calling it Donnerschlag, thunderclap, and the name carried connotations of divine judgment and inevitable destruction. Because when you heard that sound, you knew death was coming, and there was nowhere to hide that offered real protection. By March 1944, P-47s equipped with external fuel tanks could escort bombers deep into Germany, reaching targets that had previously been beyond fighter range. And the addition of 108-gallon pressed paper drop tanks under each wing, or a single 75-gallon bellied tank, extended operational radius to over 475 miles, allowing Thunderbolts to fight over Berlin and return to England with fuel reserves for combat. With the paddle blade propeller providing improved performance even when loaded with external tanks, Thunderbolts could fight on equal terms immediately after dropping tanks. No longer vulnerable during the transition from ferry configuration to combat configuration, but the most significant transformation came when P-47s transitioned from pure fighter operations to ground attack missions, a role that would make them the most feared aircraft in the German arsenal and fundamentally alter the Wehrmacht's ability to operate in daylight. The standard P-47 could carry to 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pound bomb under the fuselage, a bomb load equal to early war medium bombers, and later variants added zero-length rocket stubs for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each one equivalent in destructive power to a 105mm artillery shell, combined with the 850 caliber machine guns that could strafe with devastating accuracy. The Thunderbolt became a complete weapon system capable of destroying anything, from individual soldiers to heavy tanks, from locomotives to bridges, from supply depots to headquarters buildings. The transition to ground attack began in earnest in April 1944 as Allied air forces prepared for the invasion of France, systematically destroying German transportation infrastructure and isolating the battlefield from reinforcement and resupply. Oberst Hans von Locke, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, experienced P-47 ground attacks firsthand during movement operations, and his post-war memoir described the experience in terms that conveyed both tactical analysis and genuine terror. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces behind their canopies, so low that our anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress far enough to track them. Von Locke wrote decades later, the sound was terrifying. Engines roaring at full power, rockets screaming off the rails with sound like tearing fabric amplified to inhuman levels, then the hum of those heavy machine guns that sounded like industrial machinery rather than weapons. A column of our trucks simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles transformed into burning wreckage in one pass, the road covered with twisted metal and bodies, fuel fires burning so hot we couldn't approach to rescue wounded for 30 minutes. The psychological effect on the men was devastating. They called them jabos, fighter bombers, but these were something beyond that classification. They were flying artillery with the accuracy of snipers and the persistence of wolves. On June 6, 1944, over 500 P-47s provided air cover for the invasion beaches, creating an impenetrable umbrella that extended from sea level to 30,000 feet, and the Luftwaffe's response to history's largest amphibious invasion demonstrated how completely air superiority had shifted to the Allies. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones were massacred by Thunderbolts stacked at every altitude, employing the boom and zoom tactics that had been refined over 18 months of combat. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of WW2, one of only 3 German pilots to reach the beaches that day and survive, reported that the sky belonged to the Americans in ways that made resistance suicidal rather than merely difficult. We tried to break through at dawn with 12 fighters from our group, Fischer transmitted after landing at his base with battle damage. I was the only one to return, and my aircraft has over 40 hits. The P-47s were waiting at every altitude. You couldn't climb over them because they were stacked to 30,000 feet, couldn't dive under them because they were making strafing runs at sea level, couldn't outrun them because their speed exceeded ours. In any flight regime, their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain falling into the channel. In the weeks following D-Day, P-47s systematically destroyed German movement in daylight hours, forcing the Wehrmacht to adopt nocturnal operations that severely hampered their ability to respond to Allied advances and concentrate forces for counterattacks. By early 1945, the transformation of German opinion from mockery to terror was complete, and the statistics of P-47 operations defied comprehension in ways that revealed the true scale of American industrial dominance. In the European theater alone, Thunderbolts claimed 3,752 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 3,315 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 86,000 railway cars demolished, 9,000 locomotives reduced to scrap metal, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles destroyed, 68,000 trucks obliterated, and 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles eliminated. Numbers that represented not just tactical victories but the systematic destruction of an entire military infrastructure. The 9th Air Force, primarily equipped with P-47s operating from bases in France and Belgium, flew 213,873 combat sorties between D-Day and V-Day, dropped 132,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds of ammunition, and launched 60,000 rockets, consuming resources at rates that German logistics officers found incomprehensible when analyzing captured American supply documents. Major General Galland, commanding the Luftwaffe fighter arm in the war's final months, admitted in a 1945 interrogation that German pilots had developed what medical officers classified as jobo fever. Physical symptoms of stress appearing when Thunderbolts were reported in operational areas. Veterans who had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without flinching now became physically ill before missions against P-47s. The distinctive thunder of approaching Thunderbolts caused panic among ground troops who understood that survival meant finding cover immediately. Though experience taught that cover was often inadequate against weapons that could penetrate concrete and collapse buildings. The ultimate demonstration of American industrial superiority came during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate attempt to destroy Allied air power on January 1, 1945. When nearly 900 German fighters launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands in a final gamble to regain air superiority. At Y3 airfield near Metz, home to the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, the German attack initially succeeded in destroying 22 Thunderbolts on the ground along with several support aircraft. And a captured German pilot brought to the command post pointed at the burning aircraft and taunted American officers with a question about what they thought of such destruction. Major George Brooking's response became legendary throughout the 9th Air Force and perfectly encapsulated the resource disparity between nations. He pointed to the flight line, where ground crews were already pushing damaged aircraft aside and preparing hard stands for replacements, told the German that by tomorrow morning they would have 40 new Thunderbolts flown in from depots in England, then asked how long it would take Germany to replace the pilots they'd lost in the attack. The German pilot's smirk disappeared as the implication settled into his consciousness. The understanding that America could replace aircraft losses within days while Germany's pilot losses were permanent and irreplaceable.